Good morning, guys. Welcome to the podcast. Almost Happy New Year. And today I've got a fantastic guest for you, Christopher Swing. He's a seasoned executive driving innovation across logistics, banking, healthcare, and private equity. And he's got diverse industry experience, leadership insights. We're going to talk about success stories, case studies, and I'm really happy to have him on, especially the last day of the 2024, and really happy to pick his brain. So, Chris, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Briefly introduce yourself and we'll dive right into the questions and add value to the audience.
Sure. My name is Christopher Swing. I'm the president and chief executive officer of Vantage Surgical Solutions, which is a cataract and GI surgical solutions provider for rural healthcare in the U.S., primarily in the eastern 30 states. We started off as a cataract surgery business in 1990. I joined a family-owned business, acquiring most of it, sold it off to private equity in 2001. I'm also a bank director, and I just started a leadership podcast.
Yeah, fantastic intro and segue. And I'm always happy to have people doing great things, especially when you sell a company or business or arm to private equity. And we'll first kick off the conversation just talking about just one is, where do you see just trends and challenges in the industries that you've seen, just key big things that people should be looking out for in 2025?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue that we're seeing as far as on the banking side of the business is just the real estate industry in general, and not so much that it's not a great place to invest, but a lot of the investment thesis that happened when real estate rates were much lower are now starting to reset. And so some of those investments don't look near as cash flow positive as they go through the interest rate resets. We didn't fall as fast from an interest rate perspective as we had hoped. So I think there's going to be some struggles there. Though most investors have capital sitting on the sidelines, it'll just reduce the returns on those investments, assuming that they're able to inject more capital or take on other investors. In the healthcare space, I think the biggest concern that we have today is just the sheer volume of dollars that we're spending to take care of people every day. For those of you who have employees like I do, you understand that it's very expensive to attain their insurance, as well as the level of deductibles. I remember still back in many years ago, probably 14 or 15 years ago, when I about died because they told us we were going to have a deductible on our health insurance. And I was like, wait, what's the point of having insurance if you guys aren't going to pay? And that's come a long ways, because that first deductible was $500 that we were all freaking out about. And now we're seeing deductibles in the thousands of dollars. And employees that are average everyday people are incurring huge amounts of medical debt because of those deductibles. And I think those are the things that are probably most concerning in the healthcare space.
Yeah. And yet healthcare insurance companies and their CEOs continue to profit and have these massive for their shareholders. Obviously, something's going on there, but that's not besides the discussion. So talk about just where do you see AI playing into all of this?
So it's definitely got a unique place as we move forward. And if you think about people who are doing any type of screening or using data to be able to identify potential risks. So like, for instance, in GI now, you can add, I think it's called a Genie, to your GI colonoscopies, and it will identify places that it believes might be a polyp that needs to be inspected with a box on the screen. And so the surgeon is basically getting extra set of eyes, I would argue, in those opportunities to be able to see things that the naked eye can't. And I think there's a huge opportunity as we move forward. I think where it will be interesting is the AI is also going to drive us to do less tests, because it's going to know which tests are more likely to provide either a positive outcome or some sort of a diagnostic decision. And so I think it will definitely change the landscape in healthcare dramatically. And I think that's true in the banking side too, because as you guys know, we're doing lots of determinants of what industries are going to be impacted over the next 5 years as far as where we're making loans and things like that. And I think as those models are much more involved and evolve to where they can predict some of the future negativity, you'll see some changes in banking as well.
Yeah, I'm optimistic about banking. A couple years ago, I was actually pessimistic. I thought banking sector would never get disrupted, but now we got blockchain and we got a lot of disruptive technology, and hopefully healthcare is the next piece. And hopefully with Trump, he'll reform education and kind of set us up to make our country a bit more competitive and stronger because we've been stagnant and on the decline for decades now. So next question I have for you is it's interesting because you've got private equity, you got business operations, you got culture. So I'm interested in the private equity insights and what are the most important factors you consider when evaluating investment opportunities, and what advice do you have for those interested in looking to get into private equity?
So I think on the private equity side, the things that come to mind when I think of transactions are minimum deal size. And the reason for that is just the sheer volume of due diligence that's done on those transactions. And every firm is different, right? But for us, we do significant due diligence, which means that you need to have a significant entity in order to make the transaction make sense. Because by the time we do due diligence, you might wipe out potentially as much as a year of their earnings if they're a smaller organization. And so I think when we look at what we're trying to add to Vantage, we're focused on what are those entities that not only can add value, like using Vantage's core customers and building their business around our core customers, but also where might they have a geographic stronghold that maybe we're weaker in, and we could therefore use our customer our products in their customers as well. So I think it's a situation where we're looking for a lift on both the acquisition side as well as on the core business side. And then in addition to that, it's really focused around, is the business big enough and viable through due diligence that you can get the transaction completed and still create value.
The next question I have for you is this intersection of private equity and entrepreneurship. And what do you think are key elements for successfully identifying and scaling promising business ventures?
So I'm a big believer in investing in the jockey and not so much the horse. And so I think as you look for ways to find success, you go to people who have had success in the past. And that's who we're looking at. So like when we're looking at really early investment or potentially following a company to potentially invest in future years, we're really looking for someone who's had success before. We believe that's not something that just happens. And we also believe that if in fact they were able to overcome the hurdles to get to an exit in a previous company, they're most likely able to do the same in this one.
So, and a follow-up question I have for you is just what's in terms of, for example, if private equity comes and they're interested in buying the company or business or acquiring it, and what are some factors to consider when saying, okay, I don't want to sell the private equity versus, because a lot of, for example, in startups, it's like sometimes these companies are acquired or whatnot, and some of them forego that to have a massive, like a public offering or something. What are some factors to consideration whether to accept or reject a private equity offer?
I truly believe that if you have something that private equity wants, you have something of value, right? And so I think it's important that you think through, do you have the wherewithal, whether that be your team, yourself and your investors, do you have the not only the capital, but do you have the ability to get to that level? Because so often what we forget is that a lot of times what was good to get us to the point we're at today isn't what's going to get us to the next level. And I think it's really important that we step back and think about it. And are we ready to make some of those transitions in our teams in order to get to that next level? And that's a really hard decision, both from a culture as well as from just an entrepreneurial perspective. Like these are the people that got you to the point where you have something that's investable. And are they going to be the ones that get you to that next level? And the question becomes whether you're capable or willing to make some of those decisions or desirous of making some of those decisions. Because along with the transaction is a natural progression that, hey, there's going to be things that are going to have to change in the organization in order to continue to grow it to a point where we can get the types of returns that we're looking for on the private equity side.
Yeah, interesting. And I have some further questions is
Yeah.
basically when, this whole transition and, building a culture of continuous improvement, and how do you cultivate a mindset of continuous improvement within organization, and what strategies do you use to keep employees engaged and motivated?
So I think the first thing that you have to do is you have to give people a vision of where you're going. And I'm not just talking about your vision and values, and I'm not even talking about like for the next year, what's our focus. So often we lose in translation what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And therefore, people are always going to be making decisions on our behalf or on behalf of the organization all the time. And the key to it is that we need them to know, are they getting us closer to our goals or further away? We hire great people and we know that they're going to make the right decision. And when they don't make the right decision, we need to dive in and say, okay, so what am I doing that's causing them not to understand what it is that we're trying to accomplish? Rather than chasing after them, why are you making this decision incorrectly over and over again? I found that a lot of times it's my own lack of clarity that is causing them not to understand where to go. And so I think in order to get them to engage, the next thing you need to do is you need to have a clear and constructive way to push decisions down in an organization to those who are affected. Because if you tell them where you're going and you give them the tools to enable them to make some of those decisions, and then you get out of their way, what I've found personally is that they make better decisions on behalf of our organization than a lot of times their managers would make. And here's why. Because they've lived it over and over again. And as much as we like to think, hey, we know what's best for the organization, or we know what's best for this department, or we know what's best for this customer, a lot of times we haven't thought through the implications of, if we choose A, what's the probable outcome? And if we choose B, what's the probable outcome? And how does that affect everyone to the level that the person who does that job every day does? And so that's my recommendation, is that you make sure that you clearly communicate, and then clearly communicate in 25 different ways. How do you say the same thing? And then make sure that they understand the framework in which the lowest level employee is able to make decisions and what their authorization thresholds are. And then help them, coach them to make those decisions. Because as you make more and more decisions at a ground level or at the lowest level possible, the impact of that one decision isn't that great, but the impact to the organization is significant, because now you have a whole lot more people that know exactly where you're going and they know what they need to be doing in order to drive you there.
Fascinating. And what I want to do is merge these two concepts, because once a company is acquired by private equity, obviously there's a change in leadership management. There's a huge transition. And so how do you navigate, just change a culture, change in transforming business operations during these? Sometimes the company that gets acquired becomes basically the culture changes overnight. What are your thoughts?
So there's a fulcrum when you have a transaction. It's like when a company is struggling. So often the owners don't want to inform their employees of why they're making these different decisions. And so what happens, the natural process that we went through in the past carries through into the current day. This happens to change at the point in time in which there's a transaction, because everybody knows that everything is different going forward. Now, in my own personal experience, I was the president and CEO of this company prior to private equity buying it. And they chose to bring in another CEO over the top of me, which turned out to be a failure for us as shareholders, because I still am a minority shareholder, as well as for the organization as a whole. Now, granted, they didn't know that when they brought him in. It was just a bad culture fit. Then they turned around and elevated me into the CEO role and gave me my company back, which is a little bit refreshing as for both the employees as well as for myself. and it renewed our desire to get back on track in a faster and more aggressive means. And I think that those transitions are really important. And so whether that be that you're struggling and so you're changing how you're managing the organization, or that there's a transaction and so we're changing how we're managing the organization, it doesn't really matter what that reason is, but we need to clearly communicate it, even though we don't necessarily want to. And I think that will help people then to prepare themselves for, hey, this is going to be different. It also gives them the mentality of saying, okay, so what we did in the past isn't necessarily what we're going to do in the future. And that's such an important lesson for the lowest level team members, because otherwise what happens is they just keep doing the same automatic decision processes that they've always done. Whereas if they know that whether we're privately held for profit with the intention of maximizing profit in the past, and now we're private equity, and so we're obviously trying to maximize profit, but first we're going to try to grow our top line 20+% year over year. The decisions aren't the same, right? So how we took care of a customer and how we dealt with issues in the past may be slightly different than how we do them in the future. And so I think it's really important that they understand that there is a transition, no matter what the causation for that leadership transition is, whether it's people transition or whether it's just philosophy transition. The more that you can communicate through what that looks like, the better that they'll be prepared to make decisions as they move forward.
Yeah, I really love that. We have around the 5-6 minutes remaining, and your vision looking ahead, where do you see healthcare logistic industries heading? What trends do you think will shape the future, and how can businesses position themselves in 2025 for success?
So I think the biggest issues, as Christopher, that we're struggling with in healthcare is a reduction in the number of practitioners. So the specialty practitioners, as well as just general practitioners. And what I'm talking about is physicians themselves. And so I think what we're going to have to do is figure out how we operate huge hospitals and systems differently than we have in the past. And there's a couple of different ways we can do that. We can do that via helicopters, right? So everybody has an emergency, you jump in a helicopter, you fly 2 hours away, which doesn't take that long in a helicopter, and seek care. You can do that by a hub and spoke model where you have like regional hubs, say like in my areas like St. Louis or Chicago. And so you have feeders that are operating hospitals in between, and they basically transition all those patients into those hubs, and that's where most of the providers are. But what we're really focused on are the general, non-complex lifestyle procedures. And so when I think of that, the services that we're going to continue to provide are obviously like cataract surgery, gastroenterology, women's health, those towards urology, those types of things that are like lifestyle specialties. And what we're trying to help is enable local hospitals to not have to invest in the advanced technologies that we're using. And thereby, instead of us buying a piece of equipment and letting it sit in a hospital for 30 days a month, we're taking it into that hospital for one day for use, and then we're taking it to 11 or 12 other facilities in order to utilize it. And so therefore, it reduces cost. It allows us to provide another layer of specialists, but in the technical. And so either running the equipment or first assist in surgery. The other thing that I think is really going to be a struggle, and I don't know how to deal with it, especially with the big changes that we've seen, and I think we'll see some significant changes as we move forward, and we're already seeing some of them, is around anesthesiology and CRNAs. And I don't have a solution for that. I think what you're going to see is both RNs will start doing more of the lower invasive procedures, as well as you may see some technicians, instead of nurse anesthetists, there'll be some sort of technician that will help support with oversight. But yeah, I think there's a lot of exciting things happening in healthcare. We're a pro healthcare investor supporter. We're very focused on rural healthcare, especially because there's a huge population that lives in rural healthcare areas. And we want to make sure that the people who aren't close to these major metro centers are still able to receive care.
Yeah, healthcare is a real big issue, and it's really interesting to see the types of work that everybody's doing to help solve the problem. And really fascinating discussion, very insightful. How can people find you and reach out to you and connect with you?
Yeah, the easiest way to connect with me is on LinkedIn, Christopher Swing. You can find me there. I'm sure the link will be in the notes. I am rolling out a podcast called Faithful. It's super exciting. It's faithful.buzzsprout.com. I'm sure it will also be included, and I would love to connect with you. Feel free to message me if you have any questions or any thoughts or interest in being on my podcast. So
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much for coming on, and happy New Year. And we'll see you next year. And keep up the great work.
thanks for